So I think we'll progress with this theme in this panel. I think, where is Rana? Come up. Yes, and Rohit, come up. So the next conversation is going to take forward some of the themes that Margrethe raised. And to take us there, we have a delightful panel, a group of friends. Rona Farrohar is, of course, well known. She's a columnist for the Financial Times and an author. Rohit Chopra needs no introduction either. He is former FTC commissioner, now the chair of the Financial Protection Bureau in the US, but more than that, a protagonist of much of the change that we're going through. And then online, we have René Repasi. He would have been here, but I understand, René, that you have an important vote in the parliament, in fact, at 9:30, so we are going to have to fit you in somehow. And it's a shame that we don't have you in person, and we're mindful that you need to leave. So let me start with you, Rana. You have been certainly an extraordinary scholar of the changes and a chronicler of the changes that we're living through your books, through your columns. Your book of Homecoming has a real riveting account of where we are and how we got here. The end of hyperglobalization and of neoliberalism and starting from the financial crisis. So tell us how you see this change and how this is translated into a major rethink in terms of policy on the part of the current administration, but also before.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Christina, and thanks to everyone for having me here, and thanks to the commissioner, who is fantastic. Let me back up and say that, we're here to talk about antitrust regulation and the political economy. The political economy is probably the term there that has gotten the least attention. And that's really starting to change now, I think, particularly in the US. Christina, you very kindly mentioned my book, Homecoming, and I'm often asked to describe, a one-line summary of this book. And what I say is the world is not flat. Which is, a little bit of a reference to my friend and colleague Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, which was written in 2005, and the period between 2003 and 2007 in which that book was written was the highest global growth in history, right? That was the apex of what I would call the neoliberal era, and I would define neoliberalism, which is often used in lots of ways on either side of the Atlantic, as being the political philosophy that says that capital, goods, and people are all going to move equally smoothly and quickly to wherever they are most needed. That's the whole world is flat theory. That began to break down, of course, in 2008 after the financial crisis. But I would say that it really started to break down visibly to real people during the pandemic and now because of the war in Ukraine. And why is that? Well, the neoliberal theory was based on the idea of cheap capital, mostly from the West, certainly from the US, going to cheap labor countries, oftentimes in Asia. It was also based on the idea of being able to get cheap energy from, say, autocrats in Russia. All of those things are now changing, and we see that the world isn't flat. And that's really the shift that we're seeing in the political economy today. It's something that the president, Joe Biden, has been incredibly committed to making a change that is not just about lowering consumer prices and raising share prices and saying, okay, we're done here, nothing else to see, there's no problem. This idea of cheap is going away. Cheap capital is changing, monetary policy is changing. Cheap labor is changing. Even before the Trump administration came in, you saw China coming out with the Made in China 2025 program, which said, look, we're a richer nation now. We want to consume and produce more regionally. Putting aside the problems of this particular regime in China, I think that that's actually kind of a wise economic decision. Regionalism in some ways reduces energy costs, it can reduce carbon emissions, nothing wrong with that. Lots of changes though. The world is not flat, it's bumpy. So where are we going from here? Well, The administration put forward in 2021 an executive order that I think was really undercovered, really underreported. Tim Wu, who I believe is going to be speaking later, was one of the key architects of that and can maybe say more. But this document, I think, is going to be remembered as something similar to the Milton Friedman piece in the New York Times in the 1970s that said, you know what, shareholder value is what matters, consumer price is what matters. This Biden executive order from 2021 says, no, we've left that era, okay? It's not just about consumers, it's about stakeholders, it's about labor, it's about small businesses, it's about a variety of stakeholders within a community, which is in some ways a much more European way of looking at things, almost a Germanic way, you could argue, about looking at things. And we have to bring value to an entire community, not just owners of assets, and it's not just about lowering share prices, which, as we know, got us global wealth, but it also got us incredible in-country inequality, which is why we got some of the political dynamics that we did both in the US and in Europe. So we are moving away from that now, and we can already see some of the shifts. And the commissioner mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course has been controversial transatlantically. The way that I would look at the Inflation Reduction Act is a move to say we need to create more resiliency. One of the things that we saw in the pandemic, in the war, and frankly in the financial crisis, although it didn't get as much attention, and maybe Rohit and I will tease that out, we saw that this system of efficiency theory, which is all about siloing, it's all about big, efficiency favors big. It favors big companies and it favors big countries, and both can be monopoly powers. And we're going to turn more towards resiliency now. You can see it in semiconductors. Did anyone ever think that it was a good idea to have 92% of the world's high-end semiconductors in Taiwan? That's not good for Europe. It's not good, actually, for China. It's certainly not good for the US. So I think it's a welcome thing that many regions are now thinking about how to increase resiliency and think about a broader group of stakeholders. So we can see that that's going to change antitrust. We can see that, in the executive order, President Biden actually said, hey, the Bork era is over. We're in a new era. We absolutely are, but maybe I'll stop there and we can pick up some of these threads.
Great. Let me hand over to Rohit. The emphasis is on a basket of policies that are more focused on the supply side, less on efficiency and consumer in the traditional Borkian way.
I think the debate in some ways, maybe not in certain communities, but in most global financial centers, capitals, I think the debate is somewhat settled that the 1980 to 2020 way of doing things didn't work out very well. And that we can't just assume, as Rana said, that interest rates will be super low forever. We cannot assume that stuff just comes out of thin air and will always be there, and that we have to be ready for shocks, we have to be ready for change. And that requires a much more rigorous and surgical view of approaching how we look at our markets. Rana mentioned the president's executive order. It has fundamentally given a different message to regulators and to agencies about their role in promoting entry, in promoting resilience, and frankly, not just doing what I think Wall Street was expecting. And, I might disagree a little with Rana that in many ways it's a Germanic way. I actually think it's very, very American, but not just caring about those who already have power. So it is a way of thinking that I think has been actually quite transformative, and we're just at the start of it. We're just thinking about how do we want to shape our banking and financial system so that we do not have what we had during the financial crisis, where the devastation in the US and globally actually had led to so much fundamental political change as well. We are starting to see places where there's actually not much difference in views across political parties. the interest in production, made in America issues, standing up for an economy that actually people can break into rather than just have, corporate royalty who rules for generations. So I think there's a lot that we have to start. There's some old, I think, paradigms that we're done with, and it's a new rule book that we're writing.
Let me move on to René. We want a European voice in this discussion. We heard the beginning of a vision to Americans, and I was watching you nodding when Rana said maybe a slightly more Germanic view. I know Rohit doesn't necessarily agree, but give us a perspective from Europe as to how you see this evolution.
Thanks, Christina, for also having me invited here, and apologies that I cannot be in the room, although I think my is more or less the shortest one from all of you. But indeed, I have to go to vote over minutes. Indeed, I was nodding, but of course, as a German, I'm not entirely objective when it comes about the description of the Germanic way. Hence, let me put it like this. As a German, knowing our economic model, I can totally concur with Rana's analysis that what she describes, that is about stakeholders, it's about workers, it's about communities, it's about small business, that is a Germanic way of doing things. And even better if Rohit confirms that's now turning into an American way. No problems. The Americans very often copy-pasted European ideas. I don't insist on the trademark if you just change your economy accordingly. And that brings me a little bit to the European perspective. I personally think we do agree in the analysis that what we have seen in the last decade is nothing else than the end of hyper-globalization, starting with the financial market crisis, going over to the pandemic, and what we now see as the consequences of the war in Ukraine. And that has shown to us that the way of how our supply chains are built, it doesn't work. The very fact that even in Europe, we do not have critical infrastructure and critical industries being established anymore was a wake-up call. And we react to this. We are discussing now something that is called Single Market Emergency Instrument, which is precisely looking at this. We have to reestablish critical industries again in Europe. And in that sense, industry policy is getting a new place in the policy mix in the European Union. That's a good way. And here, Americans and Europeans are following the same spirit. Also, the good thing about the Inflation Reduction Act, if I may say so, is it's focused on the transformation, on the green, not just throwing out money to stay in the US, but earmarking it to green and social. And I do believe that's the right thing to do. And it's the thing that the Europeans also want to do. We see that by transforming our economy, we do not want to fall for the mistakes of the past that we have seen in other areas of the world. So that by transforming, by trying to address hyperglobalization, that we end up with the curse of bigness within Europe. So by simply saying that our model of economy with a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises protected by our very restrictive merger control should now be thrown over for the sake of industry policy in order to create smooth global players. In my eyes, it doesn't work, precisely for the reasons that Rana analyzed. So therefore, there's a role for our competition policy to basically stick to its principles in order to protect a more diverse economic model as we have it. Therefore, I also think Europeans must be, when it is about the US Inflation Reduction Act, have more self-confidence in the strengths of our economic model and the internal market. And the strength being precisely that our economy was always about stakeholders. It was always about workers. Speaking of the co-determination model in Germany, for example, it was always about communities and it was always about small businesses. So let's keep what is good and not try to destroy it with overflooding with state subsidies by simply trying to keep up with what we think is the core of the IRA. I do believe that is a wrong way to do so. On the contrary, and I'm very much convinced after the two analyses that I heard by Rana and Rohit, that the strength of it all is the US and the European model are even more convergent than they were in the past. We see that America let's say 10, 20 years ago, that's finished. So the old American European way is back. And that makes it that the Americans should at least reconsider the way of how the IRA is transposed, is designed, in basically focusing everything on the US, seeing that in Europe and in the US, we have the same idea of how economy should work, of how transformation should work, and we should therefore cooperate and not run into a subsidy race that has a certain protectionist flavor. Let me conclude that given the role of merger policy and competition policy that I have mentioned on the one hand, on the other hand, we also have to look at changing our ways into the role that we have in designing in economic policy. So I'm here speaking about a mission-driven economic policy. We have done this now with the European Union Chips Act, and we are discussing it in the context of our current reforms with the Zero Emission Act. I do believe there is a need also in our colorful Europe of a more public role in creating opportunities for businesses by concrete missions being earmarked and targeted on what the transformation needs. So in that sense, we see developments in Europe, we see developments in the US, and I consider them rather more convergent than being divergent, and we should believe in each other's strengths and do not be tempted to throw a cooperation that is here necessary overboard. Thank you.
Let me ask you a follow-up briefly, because I know you have to leave, and then I'll turn over to Rohit and Rana again. So you talked about convergence twice. You used the word twice, and it is one way of looking at it, as between Europe and the US. But another way of looking at it is that the US is adopting effectively on a large scale what appears to be a series of subsidy, a big package of subsidies, which is what Europe in some way has done in different ways in the past. And Europeans are now saying, how dare you? What's going on over here? This is not what you normally do, and it is the concern of it being a race is live in the relationship between the two. How do you see that from the parliament? And again, you mentioned competition as being one ingredient there. Where do we sort of set the balance between these?
No, well, you're definitely right that also the Europeans were using subsidies. Yet the scale of European subsidies is a different one, since the European Union budget is 1% of GDP, and it goes mostly to French farmers. And that's, I don't think, big trouble for the Americans. The rest is then some national subsidies for those that are capable to finance it, and that's mostly Germany. And the national subsidies, they are actually limited by EU state aid control, because we do not want to undermine internal competitiveness in order to get somewhat external competitiveness. So in that sense, I think that the subsidy race from the European perspective is not as tough, but I also do not believe that there is so much of a tough subsidy race in the analysis of the Inflation Reduction Act than we here in Europe currently do. Because we should also not forget, as I mentioned, the positive elements in there. It's earmarking to transformation and to social conditionality. And honestly, also European good and service producers can only benefit from the fact if American workers finally get wages, because ultimately they can buy good European cars. And if you're then back to competition, I believe our car production is still more competitive. But that's a different question, not for here. So I see the changes that you're describing, but I don't find them threatening. So at the same time, then I believe there's a good thing about looking homewards, what the Americans do, like what do we do for America, but at the same time, not forgetting that there is a grain of added value to have cooperation, and in particular, transatlantic cooperation has proven itself, at least since Joe Biden is president, as being a good driver for a global transformation.
Thank you very much. Do you want to take on and expand on the points you were making about we're at the beginning of a major rethink, and what is next, and how do you see it?
Yeah, I see it
René.
in a way of your title, and in your opening you mentioned people sleeping under a stone. I forget the analogy you use. But yeah, things are alive again. Antitrust, I think, is the bare minimum. Don't let industries become so concentrated, and don't allow abuse to be pervasive. And regulation, I think in the US, we're starting to think each sector regulator, how do we shape and make sure that it is decentralized, that things can start, that people can grow, that it is not just the same folks ruling for years and years. I'm mostly here in Europe to work with them and the British on open banking, open finance, the ability for people to switch, to take their data with them, to not be trapped. And I think that's not uncommon. Lots of regulators around the world are thinking about what can they do to create a much more competitive environment. And in some ways, when you look back at the history of the United States, the real place we have thrived, telecommunications, biomedical, so many parts of our economy grew in the 50s and other eras when we had that real base of public investment built upon that, a market structure that allowed new ideas to flourish. And I'll be honest, when I served as a FTC commissioner, I really wondered that firms that were really focused on building gatekeeper power and merging, it was so clear that's great for Wall Street. It's not necessarily, I think, what we want people focused on. We would much, and the data shows innovation, the data shows discovery is much more happening at firms that aren't necessarily fixated on financial engineering, merger conquests, but really looking at how they can build something new and something that fundamentally transforms.
Can I build on this a little bit? I think that this is a very important point Rohit is making. The idea of regulatory desiloing, which is, I think, starting to happen a little bit in the U.S., where dots are being connected, particularly within this administration. I've been covering economics and business for over 30 years. I've never seen an administration where folks are rowing in the same direction. You know, they are really working together, thinking about what the new era is going to look like and what are the gaps between trade and financial regulation and digital regulation. I remember, just to go back to the financial crisis days, I remember having a conversation with the former CFTC chair at that point, Gary Gensler, who's now, of course, at the SEC, brilliant thinker about financial regulation, and I asked him a few questions that were sort of outside the area of derivatives, and even though I knew he had strong thoughts, he said, you know, I'm swimming in my lane. I'm swimming in my lane. These days, people are swimming around the whole pool, and I actually think that that's a good thing, and that's not, you know, industrial policy, industrial strategy, whatever you want to call it, in the U.S. anyway. It's still a little bit of a, you know, we're nervous to think about doing it, how we do it. This is just about dot connection. This is just about saying, where are the gaps in the regulatory process? If we pull a lever in the SEC, what does that mean for trade? If we make a shift in the digital space, how does that change, you know, how we think about origin rules? Yeah. I mean, so this is not about money dumps necessarily. It's about just smarter thinking.
So to me, this is key because it does speak to this point that antitrust, and you were a commissioner, really cannot be seen as some sort of silo, as a tool that is, you know, we're being modest. It's what we do. We have a role, but there is a lot of other things, and we don't really connect. I'm caricaturing, but there has been in the past very much this sense that we swim in our lane. So this idea that there needs to be much more connection of dots, I think, is fundamental to what is going on because it is cross-pollinating the antitrust reawakening in many ways. Can you expand on that?
A turning point in many ways for the Europeans looking at what happened in the US with our state attorneys general, who it was very extraordinary to see across the administrations from Trump to Biden a very, very clear consensus among these very key state officials about the importance of reinvigorating their own antitrust programs and bringing some major cases, including against Google and Facebook.
What drove that?
Well, look, the reason why I say to watch them is they're not siloed. These are people who play extremely important roles in the economy, and they see the dot connecting. They see the nexus between market power and the broader economy and, frankly, people. And so I thought that was important. The other thing you see is a huge amount of convergence and consensus, even on Capitol Hill. The tech investigation was a very key place where bipartisan consensus was reached. It didn't, unfortunately, translate into legislation, which we all know why. But the consensus around that was really noticeable. So I think in some ways the regulatory and antitrust community is catching up to reality.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to actually just go back to the Inflation Reduction Act and say a few more words, because I really do think it's getting a bit of a bum rap in Europe in ways that that it perhaps shouldn't. If you look at this, if you kind of step back from the very obvious, oh gosh, whose subsidies are bigger? Well, I mean, my take would be the more clean transition we can get, bring it on. We need it, particularly in the US. But what this is really trying to do is create some serious carrots and sticks for the companies and the countries that are doing the right thing, that are treating labor well, that are treating the environment well. And these are things that Europe has been trying to do for generations. I think that as we move forward with these changes, and this is, I mean, just to get back to our original point, this is a once-in-a-lifetime shift that we are making in the political economy. We're coming out of a half a century of having done things one way and moving into what I think is going to be 50, 60, 70 years, 100 years of doing them another way. There are going to be bumps, right? There's going to be a learning curve. And so the idea of friend shoring, for example, well, who's a friend? How do you decide that? These things are evolving and being tweaked in their conversations, and things are being course corrected. But as this learning plays out, and I think the commissioner sort of said the same thing, we're doing things at different speeds, but we're very quickly understanding what are some of the best practices here. And thinking deeply about supply chains, who owns them, how much concentration there is within them, where they are, this is where the action is going to be. And the Inflation Reduction Act is very much pushing that forward in the US.
Seen from Europe, this extraordinary shift that I can see when I come to DC is super interesting, because from here we've had the sense that we were ahead in antitrust, in the vision of what we were doing up to 2018-19. And then you're right, the attorneys general did shake the tree. I had the Nebraska Attorney General for the first time here in 2019. So is this, to both of you, is this change, what is it going to be? What is the economic philosophy that's going to be underpinning it? I heard you say in other places, Rana, we don't have an all-encompassing view of what it is going to be, but it is certainly not what's been so far. And is this kind of going to persist, or is the pendulum going to swing back? Because a lot of people, including in this room, wish the pendulum would swing back.
So I'll take a first.
They do. I promise you.
I'll take a first stab at that. I don't think the pendulum is shifting back, because again, I'll just say the three things that made the old world possible: cheap capital, cheap labor, cheap energy, all that's going away. Those are fundamentally going away, not going to change. So that's point number one. We don't have a new unified field theory, I would say, for a kind of a post-trickle-down, post-Chicago school economic philosophy, and antitrust is a part of that, but it's a broader shift, I think, as Rohit mentioned. But we do understand, and I think just very clearly at this point, that just focusing on share prices and consumer prices as the metrics of well-being have not served us well. They've resulted in a financial economy that, depending on where the markets are, could be anywhere from 2 to 4 times the size of the real economy. You got to look at those numbers and say not all of that is actual hedging, of real economy things. It's not all farmers taking out an option on the price of grain. There is something crazy going on when Wall Street is 4 times the size of Main Street. So that's point number one. Shareholder to stakeholder is something that is still evolving. ESG, as you and as the commissioner pointed out, is something that is very much still evolving. In my dreams, there would be a global price on carbon, and that would be a very quick way to get at Chinese mercantilism and greenwashing and any number of things that are problematic in the markets, but we're not there yet. I think labor standards too, and really thinking about how to make this next phase of green transition, digital transition, something that doesn't put on steroids the problems of the post-neoliberal era is going to be really crucial. And something I'm watching carefully is some of the new trade negotiations going on around digital services, U.S. and Asia, IPEF negotiations. You can look at this and say, if we don't get the policies right, you could easily see a white-collar hollowing out of a kind that is going to make what happened in manufacturing look mild by comparison. You've got to make sure that standards in labor and environmental issues at a digital level are high and are kept high. Otherwise, the politics are going to reflect the disruption then of middle class and even upper middle class jobs as a result.
Great.
Yeah, I don't see. There can be pendulums that move, but we're not going back to, again, what the I think that it's settled a bit that didn't work. Yeah. And I actually think you're going to start seeing more and more and more agreement in the U.S. on this. You're going to see a lot more people sitting in seats that I think over time are going to converge more than they have in the past. It was really interesting. Commissioner Slaughter is here too. We actually were there at the commission at a time during this shift, and I think we're there to watch a new bipartisan consensus emerge about how to approach these issues, which to me, that comes from public opinion as well. The financial crisis, I think, should not be underestimated as how much lasting power that had. The effects of trade policy in so much of our country, that has such a long-standing effect, and COVID just put it all on steroids. So I think the fragility of our economy was in such clear focus that the new playbook that the president has put in place, that the regulators are working through, I think will have lasting effects.
And one of the key messages that's coming out of what you're both saying is this notion, we'll take it forward with Tim Wu in a moment, but this notion that the focus on consumer prices, on prices as the parameter, as the benchmark for how well we are doing in antitrust is failed. This is not what we should be looking at. This is not how we should be thinking about the goals of enforcement and how we think about it. This creates discombobulation because the community says, what is it then? What is it that we are going to be pursuing? You want to finish on that note?
Well, I think, of course, price matters, but it's lazy to just focus on that. There's so much about our markets that we have to care about other than what the price is tomorrow. And look, in the digital world, this is all the more important. So again, I really think this is, the standards of rigor and analysis are shooting up in ways that I understand are going to require a very, very new mode of thinking, and not just the regulators. I mean, those of us who regulate financial services, telecom, so much, we are really rethinking that approach and not just assuming bigger is better.
But is regulation going to really take off in the US? Because we'll discuss it with Ken Buck this afternoon. Why nothing seems to go through, for example, on digital regulation on the Hill. So, the message is there, but the lawmaking is not quite
Well, I
there.
mean, I would argue that there's so much happening in the agencies to create the mechanisms for that vision of the market. And I think there's countless examples of that. Tim can talk about some of this. I know that as the financial regulators, we are thinking in very different ways now.
That's very important. We'll pick it up. You want
I'll
to
just
conclude?
say, just very quickly, to go to the consumer price issue, I think as I read these cases and as I talk to some of the folks in the agencies, it has totally sunk in that in a digital world, you're often dealing with barter transactions. In barter transactions, the laws of gravity of economics just work very differently. So that's point number one, and I think that's deeply embedded in some of the ways that the cases are being thought about. The other point about consumer prices, I agree, it's lazy and it's actually a dangerous thing to only look at that, because one of the big problems, and maybe this is a good place to end, it's about the political economy. In the last 20 years, Americans were sold a bill of goods that if we thought just about falling consumer prices, outsourced the entire industrial commons, hey, we're going to get cheaper stuff and that's going to change your quality of life, it's going to make it better. But guess what? Even before this last bout of inflation, the price of all the things that make you middle class, housing, education, healthcare, were rising at triple the core inflation rate. That's now gone off the charts in the last couple of years. No amount of cheaper flat screen TVs made that okay. And Americans know that.
Thank you very much. Join me in thanking Rohit and Rana and Tim if you want to come up. Thank you.